Hello, welcome to an episode of Connections, a regular conversation with someone interesting from our community of agronomy, crop science, and soil science. My name is Jim Cudahy. I am CEO of the American Society of Agronomy, the Crop Science Society of America, and the Soil Science Society of America. Today, I'm going to be joined by Paul Skinner, a soil scientist who lives in St. Helena, California, one of my favorite places, a quaint town in the northern part of Napa Valley. Napa Valley, of course, is inarguably one of the premier locations in the world for making high-quality wines. If you know anything at all about viticulture, you know that soils are one of the quiet but decisive forces behind great wine. Soils, of course, aren't a direct ingredient in wine, but they shape how the vine grows, how grapes ripen, and ultimately how the wine tastes. I'm going to talk with Paul Skinner about his professional journey, which I find particularly interesting. We'll likewise talk about what he's applied from his background in soil science and the practice of viticulture in Napa Valley and indeed around the world. So thanks for joining me today, Paul. First of all, can you introduce yourself and tell us what you do and where you work?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is the first time I've had the pleasure of doing a podcast. But I've been in the vineyard consulting business for about 37 years. I've consulted with both wineries and vineyards all over the U.S. and abroad in a couple of cases. So that's my what I do is try to solve problems for people using my background in soil science and plant nutrition.
And when you say people, who are these people that you're helping?
They are vineyard managers, winery owners. I've had a chance to work with all kinds of different organizations in this business. Wine grapes are probably one of the most studied crops, if not the most studied crop in the world, and so it involves a lot of non-traditional kinds of business linkages, I'd say. So there are crop management companies, there are owners, there are leasers. There's all kinds of different arrangements, and then there's wineries that are corporate. There are family-owned wineries. So I deal a lot with directly with winemakers, with viticulturalists that have quite a bit of education as well.
So you just mentioned it as a crop, but amongst the available sciences, why is it you think that viticulture and you seem to identify so significantly with soil science?
Well, it's not just me, but grapes and soils have been linked all the way back to Greek and Roman times. So there's been things written in different treatises and things about where grapes grow best, and the Charlemagne was supposedly pointed out in the Rhine River where the snow melted on the soils that were warm in the spring. That was where to grow grapes. So there's a long history of I guess relationship kind of between soils and grape growing and winemaking. But I'd say it didn't happen to get really into the science until the 19th century, when growers started to look more carefully at where their grapes were growing and how they were growing, and their winemakers started to add their input as to what grapes grew best in what soils. And so ever since that sort of combination has flourished, that relationship has been sort of solidified certainly in the industry and the people that research viticulture. The soils are a key component because it's where the grapes grow.
Yeah. Hey, talk to me about your own career path. I know you have a background in forestry, but what brought you so narrowly to viticulture, and how did you get there?
Well, that too is a long, winding trail, if you will. I started probably the linkage that I go back to was I was a student at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and they had a program abroad to satisfy their summer camp requirement, and it happened to be I was there at the right time. Our first summer abroad program was in the Black Forest in Germany, and we went there to study, look at the practices of the German institutes that manage forests and water and wildlife resources sort of were using. But one of the things the hosts arranged for us was to go to a research station in Freiburg that was solely dedicated to growing grapes and making wine. And in Germany, this history goes way back more than a century or two. The institutes that have been studying wine growing and in that environment have been there for a long time. And so we got to taste these really incredible wines that I had never run across before, and Rieslings and Sylvaners and a variety called Spätburgunder, which is related to Pinot Noir, and so that sort of was the beginning of my wine, I think, interest at a different level than what I'd ever experienced here in the U.S. So I didn't do anything about that for 10 years, actually. I went into the Peace Corps and I worked for EPA. I worked for the Soil Conservation Service. I had a number of jobs dealing with different environmental aspects of my education, including the Forest Service. And I ended up at Colorado State, and I was finishing my master's in agronomy, and I had done a master's project mapping soil site relationships of a weed that was taking over the Great Plains called leafy spurge. And as I finished that work, a book came out, Hugh Johnson's World Wine Atlas. And in that atlas, it had all these pictures of vineyards all over the world and their topography and things that I'd never seen before about the wine world, relating it to the land. And so I got to thinking. I said somebody has to know something about soils with all this influence of topography and site. And so I went out to UC Davis and just happened to run into Professor Jim Cook, who was the author of General Viticulture, and he was looking for a PhD student, and I raised my hand, and he needed somebody to look at phosphorus deficiencies that he had just discovered, and that ended up being my dissertation. So I kind of, if you will, was in the right place at the right time, a few different locations and that's how I got into the wine industry. Actually, was through UC Davis and my PhD work.
And how long have you been in Napa Valley?
I've been working here since 1989. So we moved to Napa in 1993. So a little over 30 years I've actually lived in Napa, but I've been working here ever since I left. I finished my PhD at Davis in 1988. A little over almost 40 years.
What in particular have you been able to get out of your association with the Soil Science Society of America?
Well, I would say it's been the foundation of a lot of my work outside. When I left the university, I needed to keep up on the research and the agricultural science fields, and so I had joined SSSA when I was a student and got was using those research publications in my own thesis work, and so I valued the quality of the work and the breadth of the work, even though I was specifically involved in plant nutrition. I had done soil mapping. I knew about soil genesis. I'd worked in agronomy with fertility trials. So I used those journals to sort of keep me abreast of what was going on. And I attended. I attended different meetings. I think I attended one in New Orleans when I was actually doing my PhD work, and I vaguely remember giving a talk, a short talk at on my work there. But over the years, I've always not always attended every year, but every time I go, I'm just amazed at the quality of the research and the breadth of the subject matter, and so it's been sort of a reinvigorating my scientific kind of background when I do go to the meetings, which I find very and very stimulating. And so I recently sold part of my business, and part of that was having to downsize uh, my office. And I probably had 30 years of journals on bookcases in my office, uh, and I just didn't want to throw those out, so I actually gave them to a vineyard management company, and I'm sure they're probably still in storage somewhere. But if anybody needs a very good, and it wasn't just the soil science, I had agronomy journal and crop science too for many years. So I have a very good library, if you will, of the original, years that I was part of SSSA, and then more recently I got involved with an advisory board, which was really neat to look at trying to improve our relationships with the Soil Science Society of China and find new ways that we could cooperate. And I found that very rewarding to my own interest in China and what's going on there.
Can you talk a little bit about the project that you told me about before that you'd done in China?
Yeah, that it kind of came about again and sort of just happened to be at the right place. And I had been doing some work with the John Deere for a number of years using the soil probe that they had licensed that was developed actually in Madison by STI company, soil topography information, I think. And so I've been working with this probe in California as a part of John Deere wanted to offer more than just tractors at the time. This was in 2006. And so I was working with the probe all over California. We were mapping soils. It had different sensors on it on the probe that you could measure physical and chemical, or physical and compaction, and then you could switch out the probe and put a coring device and take samples for chemical analysis. So it was a and it's still being used. I think Trimble owns it now. Very powerful tool. And so I've been doing some work, and a viticulturist from Australia happened to see that work, and he had never seen anything like it. Some of the maps that we were generating on the especially the water holding capacity and things of that nature, and so he asked me to be part of this group of consultants that was going to find the best vineyard land in China. And so I talked to my wife, and she said, "Why not?" So off I went. That was in 2006. It turned out I went over probably 30 times over the next 10 years. And we planted, first we took the soil probe from John Deere over there. We mapped about 1,100 acres of new vineyard land that wasn't able even to support crops anymore under the Chinese sort of small plot farming. It was sort of abandoned land, very degraded. And so we settled on that after we looked at the probe data, and planted about 700 acres of vines. And in 2016, a French company went to China, and uh, French magazine actually, and tasted wines throughout China, and named our first vintage 2012 Syrah the best red wine in China that they had tasted. So we really were that was our goal, was to make something that was really going to stand out among the vineyards and wineries that were currently being developed in China, and we had done that, and it's still in operation, and they've won that award again. I understand it more recently, so it's something I look back on very very fondly and proudly.
So, what's the state of viticulture generally, and in particular, how much of a need is there for soil scientists within this area these days?
Well, the industry right now is in the biggest downturn that I've seen in the 30 to 40 years that I've been in the industry. So it is taking a hit because of decreased many different reasons, decreased consumption of alcohol, all kinds of trade issues, um, and just different competition of different products. So the industry is there's a lot of vineyards being pulled out, and it's questionable whether they'll ever be planted again. But whenever there's a down cycle, there's always, I think, an opportunity for new things to be adopted and be part of the rebound, if you will. And I see that as soil science playing a role in that because we need new technologies that can increase efficiencies for irrigation, for fertilizer application, for regenerative farming. All these things need new technologies and new brain power. And so I can't believe the increases in what's going on in soil microbiology in the last 10 years over when I was at Davis 40 years ago. That's just like a light year of information and methods that allow people now to have a very close look at what's going on in the soil microbiology space. And so I think people that have that ability or have that background and also have sensing technologies, those are going to be how we come out of this downturn, is that we're going to become more efficient. We're going to have vineyards that last longer, and we're going to save water and be able to adapt to climate stresses in ways that we're not currently able to do. And so I think soils and agronomy backgrounds will play a big part in that.
I think related to that, I think you may already been answering this question, but to what degree do you apply what you learned in your education in your day to day work?
I've thought often about this, and because I came from a varied background of those 10 years that I spent after I did my bachelor's till I did my master's. As I mentioned, I was in the Peace Corps as an agronomist growing corn and beans in the hills of Nicaragua, and then I went to work for the EPA and their water pollution lab in Cincinnati, studying or working on chemical components of water quality, and then I started mapping, or not mapping, but building ponds and installing drainage tile systems in corn and soybean fields in southern Ohio with the SCS. And I look back and I use something that I've learned over the years. Almost, with every week, I've drawn on some aspect of my past exposure with the Forest Service mapping soils in northern Wisconsin, uh, in the bogs of the glacial terrain there, and I that made my when I went out to map soils in California, there was nothing that could compare to going through a bog in northern Wisconsin and fighting everything that flew, that could bite you that existed. So I've had, I think the benefit, and I would encourage people to get a well-rounded background because it does help to now I work with companies that are doing irrigation. They're doing, having to construct reservoirs. I can at least relate to some of those aspects because I've been around, that work in my past, and that's kind of what only my education, but my experience after my education has sort of allowed me to do.
All right. Well, that kind of goes right into our next question. If someone was interested in getting involved with the science of viticulture, give me a path they might follow, whether they were an undergrad, a grad student, PhD student, postdoc, but then they wanted to get involved in viticulture. Give me a path they might follow to pursue that part of the science.
Well, I would say as an undergraduate, a good background in one of the ag sciences, whether it's soil science, agronomy, geology, plant science, plant pathology, any major discipline would give you a good foundation and this, maybe specialized part of the agricultural fields, but that would allow you to then um, and I think, in the past, those programs were mainly offered at land grant universities, but I would say in the last 20 years, I've seen small liberal arts colleges that offer really good plant and soil and geology type classes, maybe not agronomy so much and plant pathology, but you can get a good background in the plant and soil sciences, I think, at small colleges as well. And then after you had that background, I did say either go to work in the field uh, for a year or two and find out if you really want to do this kind of work, get your feet wet a little bit, and then go back and get a master's degree or a doctorate if you're inclined to do research. But look, there are very good viticulture programs in the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and there's even an international program in Europe where it's all done in English, but you go to different research institutes in Germany, Italy, France, and Spain, I think, and spend 2 to 3 months at each location, and then you choose a master's topic and finish a master's degree. So that's the education component that I would suggest is getting you to that goal, or getting someone to that goal is as well rounded and as quickly as possible. But there are many different people in the industry that come with philosophy degrees and all kinds of backgrounds. So it doesn't, by any means, whatever someone's background is, it doesn't say that they couldn't go to Davis and start from scratch and become a viticulturalist or a winemaker. But I think if you really want to dig into the understand the nuts and bolts of what's going on, a degree in the agricultural sciences would be the place I would start, and that's the path I took.
Okay. All right. Having a little fun here. There's a handful of movies out there about viticulture and wine. Most people know Sideways, maybe Bottle Shock, Walk in the Clouds. What movie, if any, gives the best representation of what it's really like?
Yeah, I saw this question and I had to laugh. I worked in the vineyard where Sideways was filmed in Santa Barbara County, called Sanford Vineyard, and I'd have to say, although I haven't seen all those movies, I don't think any of them even come close to describing the reality of what it's like to work in such a it's a very intense and stressful environment in wineries, and people are under a lot of exposure, and the attention that's given to the crop and the economic consequences of what's being done both in the vineyard and winery make for a very very stressful existence for a lot of people. And so I don't think any of those movies really they're more for entertainment and not really addressing the reality of what people's lives are really like in this industry.
So it sounds like there's still an opportunity to make that movie. I wonder if that's what you'll do with your retirement.
I don't know. I just learned last week I'm a part of the Napa Valley Vintners, and that there is going to be a new Netflix wine-based TV show being filmed starting next year by a pretty famous, actually the writers that did Sex and the City are going to do this new movie about winemakers and the industry in Napa Valley. So
Hmm.
they gave a little presentation, and it's going to be sort of entertaining, but hopefully they'll bring a little bit more of the reality into the mix as well. But so that's supposed to come out in a year or so. I'm not a film person myself, but I may attempt to write something about what I've done.
Okay. Well, I hope that maybe you can publish it through the societies here. So I know you also have your own label of wine. Talk a bit about that and how, if somebody were interested in maybe tasting a bottle or two, how they might be able to find your website and so forth.
Sure. We we bought a little vineyard in 1998, and I'm looking out the back door. I can look at my Cabernet vines on one window and my Grenache vines on the out the other window. So we make actually about five or six total wines from this vineyard. We don't make them every year, but the brand is called Sequum, which, as most scientists, would soil people were familiar with the sequum of the soil, the layers that exist in a profile. So originally, I thought that was a very key component to the wines that we were growing and producing, and so it's kind of been the thread. It's kind of what I've been doing for 30 years, is looking at these sequence of layers and soils and trying to figure out what they have and what they don't have and how they impact the growing of grapes and ultimately the wine that's produced. And so we settled on Sequum as the name, and we make a Zinfandel, a Cabernet Sauvignon, a Syrah. We have a red blend that combines all three of those, and then we have a rosé that's Grenache, Syrah, Cinsault blend, and we also are starting to make a Rhone blend from those same three southern France varieties. So we've got a little bit of everything. We don't make much of it. We only make about 600 cases a year at maximum, so it's mostly done through mailing lists and wine club, but we do have some distribution in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio. There are wine shops in all three of those states that carry our wine, but the best place is to look at our website, sequum.com, and we have a place where you can go and order the wine that we currently have in on the shelves from the website, and that's how we get to our clients.
Great. All right. Well, let those be the last words. I want to thank Paul Skinner for joining us today on the Connections podcast. Look for another Connections podcast where we'll be talking to another member of our scientific community to hear their stories and get their perspective. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.